There are a lot of misconceptions about the Bible's portrayal of women, particularly in Paul's letters. But women were celebrated in the early church and by Paul himself. Let's take a look at some of the women that played an important role in the early church. Phoebe. The book of Romans is considered by many to be the most important and theologically dense of Paul's letters. In the time of the Apostles, there was no postal service and letters were carried by hand to their destinations. It just so happened that the person Paul chose to carry his letter to Rome was a woman, Phoebe, who is mentioned in Romans chapter 16. Paul commends Phoebe, from the church in Cenchreae near Corinth, to whom he has entrusted his letter to Rome. Paul commends her firstly by saying that she is a deacon of the church. The Greek word here is diakonos, which means servant. However, the context heavily suggests that it signifies someone who serves the church along with the elders and overseers. The second word Paul uses to describe Phoebe is benefactor, or prostatus, which specifically means a female patron. It is likely therefore that Phoebe gave either financial aid or aid of another kind, such as letting a room in her house, or liaising with the Roman authorities. For an imaginative reconstruction of Phoebe's life by a leading New Testament scholar, see Phoebe by Paula Gooder. Debut. Priscilla. Paul also greets a couple called Priscilla and Aquila. It is notable that both here and in Acts 18, Priscilla is mentioned first. Many believe this indicates that Priscilla held a more prominent status within the church than her husband, although it could also indicate that she was born into a higher class family than he was. Either way, in both Romans and Acts Priscilla is depicted as acting with as much agency as her husband Aquila, and celebrated for it. Both of them risked their necks to help Paul, both taught Apollo about the way of God, and Paul described both as my co-workers in Christ. Hence, Priscilla is at least as involved, if not more, as the order of their name suggests to some, in the ministry in Rome as her husband. Junia. In fact, Paul also recognizes the hard work of women such as Mary, Tryphena and Tryphosa and Persis. And he gives a special commendation to Junia, along with, it would seem, her husband Andronicus. He says they are outstanding among the apostles. There is some debate as to whether Junia was indeed a woman and Andronicus's wife, but if so then she was the only female apostle. Read more about Junia and this debate. Lydia. Lydia was a purple cloth merchant who encountered Paul in Philippi, Macedonia in Acts 16. She responded immediately to Paul's preaching and was baptized, making her the first convert to Christianity in Europe. She persuaded the apostles to stay at her house during their time in Philippi. There's no mention of a husband, and the fact that members of her household were baptized indicates she was the owner and mistress of the house. It is likely to have been a large house if Paul and his fellow missionaries stayed there, suggesting she was wealthy, as does the fact that she sells purple cloth, which was expensive in those times. Later on in the chapter it says that the brothers and sisters of the church were waiting at Lydia's house. As Lydia is the first named convert in Philippi and the church met at her house, it is likely that Lydia was the permanent host and perhaps even leader of the new church. Lois and Eunice. I'm going to group these two women together as they were mother and daughter. Lois and Eunice were the grandmother and mother of Timothy, to whom Paul addresses two eponymous letters in the Bible. Paul praises them for having a sincere faith which he sees evidence of in Timothy's life. Although the mention of them is brief, Paul sees Timothy as the spiritual successor to these women, recognizing their responsibility and influence over him. The roles of these women may not seem that big compared to men such as Paul, Peter, or John, but we must remember they were operating within the norms and expectations for women in first-century Roman society, and these women showed characteristics and bravery that was valued by God irrespective of their limited social positions. In the early church, everyone was celebrated for the contributions they were able to make in their position, whether male or female. These are examples of women who were recognized and valued, not only for their responsibilities and roles in the church, but their dedicated and faithful character.